the summer of 1777, General William Howe, commander of all land forces for the British Crown in the American colonies, will move an army from New York City up to Chesapeake Bay and threaten the rebel capital of Philadelphia. He hopes this maneuver will not only draw General Washington and the Continental Army into battle, but will decide the outcome of the revolution. Should he take the capital, he theorizes the entire rebellion will dissolve. What will result is one of the largest land battles of the 18th century in North America, the Battle of Brandywine. But its outcome was very unique for both sides involved. Now, Brandywine is a massive battle to cover. We only have time to cover one aspect of this engagement, but I promise this is what many historians consider the critical hour at Brandywine. We are going to explore the hallowed grounds on top of and surrounding Birmingham Hill and learn how the American army lost this engagement but ultimately saved their own necks to live and fight another day. Since the late 17th century, life in the Brandywine Valley was largely tranquil in contrast to the bustling city of Philadelphia just 30 miles away. The terrain, though very craggy, also yielded bountiful crops. A considerable portion of those that settled the region were members of the Religious Society of Friends, known more commonly as Quakers, who found comfort in tilling up the soil to sustain their families, perhaps producing just enough extra to ship to market. Throughout the week, the Quakers would gather for worship at several meeting houses. 2.5 miles north of Chad's Ford rests one for the Birmingham Friends. This sect was organized in 1690, initially meeting in a log house before a stone replacement was erected in 1763. Services within the stone house strive for silence to encourage God's light to come forth from the Friends. But that silence was broken on September 10, 1777. The day previous, approximately 14,000 American soldiers had moved into the Chad's Ford area, when American General George Washington realized that the British were attempting to bypass his defenses near Wilmington, Delaware. While not the ground Washington had planned to fight upon, the bluffs overlooking the Brandywine could be used to block the British from advancing into the rebel capital. The quick move, however, ate into the already thin stamina of the soldiers that made up the Continental Army that summer. Anticipating a battle was imminent along the Brandywine, hospitals were established for the ill in the Army's rear. Amongst the buildings taken over for this purpose was the Birmingham Meeting House. The Quakers were forced to relocate their midweek meeting to a members' wheelwright shop in nearby Sconeltown on September 11th. That morning, the thunder of warfare emanated from Chad's Ford. A large British column had pushed its way to the west side of the Brandywine until being stalled by American artillery on the opposite bank. But any confidence Washington possessed soon wavered as his headquarters was bombarded with conflicting reports of a second British column moving to outflank the Continental Army. To give you an idea how messed up intelligence gathering was, especially for the Continental Army during this engagement, look no further than the tale of Joel Bailey. Joel Bailey was a Quaker who owned about 250 acres of property near Trimble's Ford, several miles north on the Brandywine from Chad's Ford. He was well known in the local population for making guns, making clocks, making furniture. He had a hand in helping lay out the Mason-Dixon line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And, well, on the morning of September 11th, he invited a group of redcoats to dine in his farmhouse. The problem being, these weren't redcoats. This was a company of the 7th Maryland under the charge of Captain Mountjoy Bailey. Why did Mr. Bailey invite Captain Bailey into his residence? It had to do with the fact that the 7th Maryland had uniforms that looked very, very reddish. And this was kind of an accidental boon for Captain Bailey, as while they're dining, he looked through the window and noticed down at the ford a massive column of redcoats streaming across, indicating that yes, there was now a large British presence moving around the right flank of the American line, and soon the whole army could be in danger. By the way, Captain Mountjoy would go on to become the Sergeant at Arms for the Senate in the early 19th century. It was not until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that Washington was certain a British force was threatening his flank, that being the division of Lord Cornwallis, supervised by General William Howe. Following the bloody 1775 battle on Bunker Hill, Howe had an aversion to frontal assaults. On Long Island in 1776, Howe found success with a large flanking maneuver against the Continental Army, forcing Washington to abandon New York City. At Brandywine, Howe hoped to repeat the maneuver in order to capture Philadelphia. Applying this tactic, however, required Cornwallis's column to march 17 miles via uneven roads and 2 water fords. After 8 hours of marching, Cornwallis ordered his vanguard to halt after its second water crossing to recuperate and prepare attack formations. This delay gave Washington a narrow window of time to reorientate his right wing to meet the new threat. For that assignment, Washington dispatched Major General John Sullivan. Sullivan, a New Hampshire lawyer, was already in command of a division spread out along the Brandywine Creek. In addition to reunifying his own unit, Sullivan had to coordinate the creation of the defensive line with 2 other divisions, those of Adam Stephen and William Alexander, the Lord Stirling. Sullivan chose to form the right wing of the Continental Army along several brows known colloquially as Birmingham Hill, with the meeting house of the same name sitting approximately 600 yards in front of the American line. The 5,000 Continentals that formed upon Birmingham Hill that afternoon were a motley crew. While there were some who could profess being with Washington at the victories in Trenton and Princeton, most had been recruited that past spring and never been in a major firefight. Some brigades, such as the Pennsylvanians of Brigadier General Thomas Conway, had been drilled into delirium to demonstrate the skills of the commanding officer. But in the Continental Army of 1777, there was no universal military doctrine. Discipline often hinged on the courage of a few key individuals. The 9,000 men moving to attack them were the finest the United Kingdom and Great Britain could offer. Consisting of the Brigade of Guard and German Jaggers on the flanks, the center of the attack was made of the heavyweight Grenadiers and the agile light infantry. Uniform discipline within the ranks gave Howe confidence a show of force would be enough to break down Sullivan's defense and carry the day. That display of power would be tested by several obstacles, including 8 different fence lines, a handful of buildings, and numerous folds in the landscape. To delay the British advance, a detachment of the 3rd Virginia Regiment from Stevens' division were posted several hundred yards forward of the main American line. After sparring with British light infantry near an orchard, Colonel Thomas Marshall ordered his men to regroup alongside some light dragoons behind a stone wall that still extends from the meeting house. For a moment, a portion of the British attack was stalled by just a handful of infantry and cavalrymen. After considerable effort, the light infantry managed to bypass the meeting house on both sides and threatened to surround the Americans within the Quaker graveyard. After having multiple horses shot from under him, Marshall ordered his detachment back to Birmingham Hill. The 3rd Virginia Regiment suffered terribly in this performance. Nearly half its detachment had become casualties. By 4 p.m., Cornwallis's division began their general advance toward Birmingham Hill. Across these varied fields advanced 2 battalions of Grenadiers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Meadows and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Monckton. They created an awesome impression upon the Americans, with demonstrations of pageantry in the face of death. The bear-fur caps, like this one in the collections of the Brandywine Battlefield Park, were ordered to be worn for this attack. As the march began, Lieutenant Colonel Meadows was heard shouting over fife and drum, "For damn fighting and drinking, I'll match you against the world." As these Grenadiers ascended Birmingham Hill, they came under some of the war's most intense gunfire. Meadows waved his sword to usher his battalion onward, but one of the thousands of bullets in the air shattered his forearm. The kickback threw him to the ground, breaking his collarbone in the process. The galling fire the Grenadiers walked into were backed by a battery of 5 American artillery pieces posted on a knoll now denoted by a large 19th century cast iron cannon. While Lord Stirling's position in front of the Grenadiers appeared strong, it was undermined just as the fight had begun. His left flank was supposed to be guarded by Sullivan's division, but with Sullivan now in charge of the entire defense on Birmingham Hill, his division was entrusted to Philip Humbert Penhondem de Boer. A French officer prior to the Revolution, he offered 35 years of military experience when commissioned a rank in the Continental Army in 1776. But what skills he possessed could not be translated through the language barrier. When Sullivan instructed the entire American line to shift to their right, de Boer ordered the division into a hollow on the hill's rear slope before marching in line onto the crest and wheeling about into position. By the time they appeared on Birmingham Hill, the British Brigade of Guard were in close quarters to de Boer. The Redcoats charged into the exposed flanks of the 1st Maryland Brigade, pushing them down the rear slope and crashing into their own comrades. Many Continentals fled into the surrounding countryside, de Boer included. In mere minutes, a third of the American defense had been dispersed. With the Guard on the left flank and the Grenadiers nearing the crest, Lord Stirling's men were teetering on collapse. Into this chaos came another French officer in Continental dress, but one that would become a hero in the eyes of the Americans. Just a few months earlier, Gilbert de Matour, the Marquis de Lafayette, had arrived in the rebellious colonies that shared his own aspirations of self-government. Although commissioned a major general, he had yet to receive a command when the Battle of Brandywine kicked off. Now along Birmingham Hill, Lafayette grabbed the muskets of Pennsylvanians and Conway's brigade to personally fix their bayonets in the face of the Grenadiers. While the 20-year-old tried to appear impervious to the chaos around him, a bullet tore its way through his leg and forced him off the field. With the British just feet away from goring through their torsos, Lord Stirling's soldiers retreated off the hill. The memory of Lafayette's bravery, however, remains on that hilltop to this day in the form of 2 monuments. Neither are in fact located at the site of his wounding, and one is also dedicated to Casimir Pulaski, a Polish cavalry officer who joined the Continental Army and led a mythologized countercharge against the British attacks elsewhere on the battlefield. The last Americans still in position were from Stevens' division. These Virginians and additional regiments had a formidable position, observing marshy woodlots that frustrated the light infantry. Initial assaults became pinned down by fierce musketry, as well as grape shot coming from 2 field pieces on the hilltop. The Jaggers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig von Wulm, fought tenaciously to outflank the American line. They did so up a ravine and coaxed by the sound of a hunting horn. Soon after, the British pushed their way to the crest, where a brief yet intense struggle over the cannons ensued. According to at least one British account, several American officers were found deceased around the cannon. The Virginians and additional regiments fell back across an area known as Sandy Hollow. Here, the battle transformed from a static line to a running battle. For the next 2 miles, ad hoc gatherings of Americans would try to get volleys off in the hope of delaying the British advance, even for a moment. By 5 p.m., Birmingham Hill was in the firm hands of Howe, who still had troops yet to be put into the fight. And yet, George Washington and the Continental Army will escape and live to fight another day. How is that? By all accounts, up to this point in our discussion, General Howe had succeeded in destroying the right wing of the American army. Everybody is in disarray. How is he not able to surround and capture the whole of the rebel force? Well, there's a few reasons to this. For one, the topography of the Brandywine Valley. Yes, that topography that's played both good and bad on both sides during this battle is going to play an end to this engagement. Because all of this pitted ravines and gullies and marshlands that the Americans are running across to get out of the British hands, Howe's having to advance across. And remember, Cornwallis's column had marched 17 miles that day, and now they had just fought a very fierce fight. They're exhausted, they're fatigued, they're completely depleted on energy and on supplies. Howe is operating deep in enemy territory. If he does not capture the city of Philadelphia, he is going to run low on supplies. So he is going to call a halt to the advance and actually camp in the Brandywine Valley for 5 days, go into all the local residents and foraging for supplies. That delay is going to allow Washington to regroup, pull his army out of harm's way and live to fight another day. And while Howe will ultimately march the British army into Philadelphia, he does so after the city had been evacuated by the Congress. He will not bag George Washington, the Continental Army. He will not bag the rebel government. And as Benjamin Franklin put it, Philadelphia had taken Howe, and Howe would remain in the city of Philadelphia for the rest of the Revolution, and his inaction is going to ultimately lead to him retiring from the British Army. The battle had torn up much of the Brandywine Valley, yet the subsequent encampment by the British would be even more devastating. In want of supplies, foraging parties wiped many farms clean, often without compensation. This dilemma befell the home of Gideon Gilpin. Mr. Gilpin's ancestors had received property near the Brandywine from William Penn. Mr. Gilpin's father had constructed a stone house on the property in the 1740s. At the time of the battle, Mr. Gilpin lived with his wife, Sarah, and 6 children, ranging from the ages of 2 to 13. After enduring an encampment by the Continental Army, their farm was deprived of all its crops, livestock, and personal effects by the British. To recuperate those losses, Gilpin turned his home into a tavern along the Post Road, a key artery on the Atlantic coast. The serving of alcohol, however, led to him being excommunicated from his local meeting house. In 1778, Gideon Gilpin took an oath of allegiance to the pro-rebel state government and assisted local militia for the remainder of the conflict. The Gilpin House and a reconstruction of the home, which served as Washington's headquarters, make up the core of the Brandywine Battlefield Park, established by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1949. The park preserves 50 acres that, ironically, witnessed little fighting on September 11th, but does provide valuable insight into how the battle impacted the residents of the Brandywine Valley. A visitor center educates the public on the key players and events of the battle and overarching Philadelphia campaign. A small selection of artifacts is also displayed, including the barrels of 2 British bronze 12-pound field pieces, which reportedly were present during the battle. There is also a piece of chevaux de frise that was found along the banks of the Delaware River in 2014. Lines of phrasing were laid across the river bottom to deter the British from using that waterway as an avenue of attacking Philadelphia. In 1961, the Brandywine battlefield was recognized as a National Historic Landmark. However, only a small portion of the 35,000 acres of battlefield are preserved. Fortunately, 2 tracts of land along Birmingham Hill are protected. The scene of the Grenadiers' attack on Sterling's division is now protected by the Brandywine Conservancy and Museum of Arts. Sandy Hollow, which witnessed the breakup of the last American holdouts, is a recreational park for Birmingham Township. Both properties allow people the chance to retrace a critical piece of one of the American Revolution's most important battles. Well, that's going to do it here at Brandywine, and to be quite honest, when we first set out to include this in our Philadelphia campaign series, we were under the impression we could probably hit some of the key sites in one day. Boy, were we proven wrong.
Yeah, there's a lot more to see here than I think we were anticipated.
I think this is going to serve more as an overview of the Battle of Brandywine, and I think in future we'll be back in the Chadds Ford area to do stuff in detail. But we got plenty more to see as upcoming. We're going to have a video about the Battle of Paoli, and of course, we're going to end our trip at Valley Forge.
Yep.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Actually, we've done this in reverse.
Yeah, we already did everything. We're about to head out.
Yeah, it was great. It was a great time. There's a lot of hijinks that are about to ensue in the coming videos. You think the weather's bad today. If you enjoyed this video and you want to follow the rest of the series, be sure to hit the like button down below. Let the algorithm know that history videos are important on the TubeU, on the Hate Book, and on the Rumble. And be sure to subscribe here to Readout Productions for more of the Philadelphia campaign videos and just more general explorations of historic sites. And if you want to learn some more history from my humble collector, he is a collector of Great War and Second World War militaria and all sorts of other cool stuff. His link will be in the description below. Be sure to subscribe to both our channels, and we will see you in the next video. See you next time.
Au revoir.